In partnership with Quora KiwiSaver, the Everyday Investor is proud to present News of the Money World, an informative, informal, yet hopefully entertaining look into all the latest happenings in the wonderful yet overly complicated world of finance. Catch us live every Tuesday on pretty much all the socials. Just search for News in the Money World and tune in at 7:30 p.m. sharp. Contribute to the discussion, ask a question, take a look at the world through the eyes of the markets. As usual, all content is provided on the basis of listener beware. Our views are often our own and definitely shouldn't be relied on for any investment decision. Let's get started. Hey, welcome to News Money World, everyone. My name is Darcy Onegaro, and I will be shortly joined here by Rupert Carline from Quora KiwiSaver. Rupert's having some internet connection, so we'll wait for him to sort himself out. But I'll actually take advantage of this time to explain to you what we're going to be talking about tonight, because it's a little bit of a different one. And it's something that I've been thinking a lot about lately and trying to learn as much as I possibly can about, which is the changing landscape as it relates to the US dollar. And specifically, my concern would be that the U.S. is losing its dominance on the world stage, and therefore we need to be mindful of some of the consequences. So joining us now is Rupert Carline. How are you, Rupert? Are you with me now?
Good evening. How are you? I'm here. Hopefully my computer's playing ball and it's working properly now.
No, that's fantastic. It's much better than what it was before. We got the just another brick in the wall scene behind you, which is really cool. We don't need no education, do we? Which is we're quite fitting, right? Because here we are trying to learn from current world events and make sense of it from an investing point of view. You've got kids, I've got kids. You've probably got a mortgage. I've definitely got mortgages. We're just trying to make it work, right, Rupert? So
exactly. It's all about putting one brick in front of the other and figuring out how we survive. Learning from the history and going, how do we is it going to be different this time or is it going to be the same?
Yeah, that's right. And we talked a little bit yesterday, the day before, around tonight's topic. It's something that I kind of was chewing on a lot over the weekend. And so I thought maybe I'd start, if that's okay with you, Rupert, and just go into my thesis around what I think might be happening. And then you can tell me why perhaps it's a good chance not going to be happening.
Yeah.
Why it probably does. Like, I know it does feel different every time, but I also know that this has happened before. So the US dollar, Saudi Arabia, kind of did a deal, you could say, in the early 70s with the U.S. As long as oil was denominated in U.S. dollars, the U.S. would protect Saudi Arabia. I'm going to be making some gross generalizations, by the way. That kind of is a picture of how the entire world works, right? Like the U.S. will protect the ocean, protect the high seas, so long as it's the world reserve currency. And so from a geopolitical perspective and from a financial perspective, things go well if the U.S. is behind the scenes and doing well. But over the last few years, it seems like the U.S. has kind of been doing almost everything it can to not do so well. And now it seems increasingly likely, especially with the war in Ukraine kicking Russia out of the SWIFT system, it seems like that's pushed the enemies closer together, the enemies of the United States closer together. They're now collaborating. Russia is making pretty close friends with China, Brazil, India. Like yesterday, Saudi Arabia is doing a deal now where they're going to be trading now directly, and they're bypassing the US dollar system. So this has a lot of implications, and it might not mean anything. And I think from a New Zealand perspective, it actually could spell a lot of cool opportunities in the future. However, if the US dollar does decline in its dominance, there's going to be some impacts, and interest rates coming back down in the future. Well, that's now maybe a little less likely in a world where the US dollar is not, the favorite currency out there, because right now treasuries are in demand because US dollars are in demand. But if that changes, then things could shift around. So obviously it's a mouthful. There's a lot there I've missed in terms of the pieces in between, partly because I'm still trying to get my head around it. But this is as much about potential opportunities, especially if we're sitting in New Zealand and we're looking at the BRICS countries potentially forming a new currency to compete with the US dollar. We could choose sides, maybe. I don't know how that works from a security point of view, though. That's probably another podcast. But what are your thoughts, Rupert? Like when we were talking about this, you were kind of like, well, this has happened before, and we kind of have examples of how we thought countries like Japan were going to be the new global superpower, and that didn't pan out. So, do you think I'm being a little bit over the top here with my speculation?
No, I think yes and no, right? I think actually one of the things that you just said was extremely on point and interesting, which was whoever controls the high seas are the ones that basically control the global economy.
Yeah.
And so back in the 16th century, 17th century, that was the Spanish and the Portuguese. Then it was the English, and back then it was silver was the currency of the day. And then we moved into, then it was in the 18th century, 19th century, it was the British. And then again, it was the pound that was the currency of the day. And then it's only really been since post-World War II that the US dollar dominance has been there. And to be honest, that's because the US economy has been by far and away the largest economy in the world, which has been backed up by their control of the high seas and their control of the largest military in the world. And I think, to me, they do go hand in hand. You spend a lot of time talking, we spend a lot of time talking about the faults and how the US kind of seems to be lurching from disaster to disaster. There's no question at it, right? They are an empire that are at their peak, but they are still significantly more powerful than anyone else in the world. And that's kind of my view as to why any talk of them becoming anyone replacing the US dollar, I really struggle with, right? They've still got by far and away the largest economy in the world. They've got the most innovative economy in the world. They've got the most free and open banking system in the world. They've got a political system which sometimes seems a little bit fuckoed, but at the same time, it is significantly better than any of the other political systems that we kind of are thinking about as potential replacements. And so that's kind of why when I put it together, I kind of go, look, I'm not convinced that anything yet. There will be something one day, but I'm not quite sure that we are there yet as we go. And I think I kind of come back to, and then like going all the way back, but I remember back in the late 1980s where the conversation was all about Japan.
That's right.
The Japanese were the big go-to economy. They were going to be the next biggest economy in the world, and they were going to be the largest economy in the world. It was only going to be a matter of time before they overtook the US. And the Japanese yen was going to be the kind of the go-to currency that we're all going to be doing business in, because Japan was there. I mean, at school, we were all made to learn Japanese because kind of it was even stronger than just the yen. It was even the language was going to become one of the important languages of business. And that's kind of, I find that an interesting analogy of probably where we are today, where we're kind of now talking about whether it be we're about China as being that next version of Japan. But I really struggle to see it.
Yeah. And I know like there's a lot of, I guess there's a lot of scary thoughts that you would have to think, to be honest, if you did think that the US would step back and the others would rise up, right? Like that kind of transition doesn't happen smoothly, not without a fight, unless the US actually purposefully is trying to remove itself from that global policeman role. Like if they were actually not interested in doing that anymore, then maybe some of this stuff makes a lot of sense because they're almost in a sense withdrawing from the world. But I cut you off before, Rupert. What were you saying?
Oh, no. I mean, I think they are starting to withdraw, but I mean, it's the problem is on the withdrawal, which I find fascinating, is you've got an economy which, like many other economies in the world, has been completely transformed over the last kind of 20 or 30 years. We've gone from an economy, a US economy, where back in the 1960s, there was a great job for every single person that wanted one, right? Every single American, if you wanted to work, you were happy to work. Admittedly, you probably needed to be white back then to live this dream. But everyone had the ability to buy their own home. They kind of had their 400 square meter section, standalone home. They had a car. They had job security. They had everything that everyone wants. And unfortunately, that doesn't exist anymore. And I think for a lot of people, life has got a lot harder. And I think for a lot of Americans, the focus has gone, well, hold on a sec. Why are we struggling at home? And why have we got poverty at home? Why have we got so many issues here? And spending all this time offshore and all this time kind of trying to fix the rest of the world when we kind of need to fix America. And to be blunt, that is the Donald Trump playbook right down to a T. I think that's fascinating when you come back to kind of thinking about that, right? Because I 100% get it. I'm living in Detroit. where my father used to do really well up until the 1980s when he got, or 1990s, he got fired from the auto job that he had his entire life. I'm now 35, unemployed, struggling to get by. Yeah, how am I going to blame him? I'm never going to blame anyone close by.
This isn't your direct story though. Just to clarify,
No,
this
no,
you
no,
didn't
this is not my direct story. This is the story of Americans. And so that's why we've seen this withdrawal. That's why we've seen America come back to, look, let's focus at home, let's focus on what we're doing here. And unfortunately, that kind of does have some of these security implications, it has currency implications. But fundamentally, the most important thing, and this was a big topic that came up last year when through the Russia sanctions, was Congress is very, very mindful of the role the US dollar plays in the global economy and the power that gives them. And this was the biggest debate that was had around the SWIFT system. And therefore, what does is actually the first time they've properly weaponized the US dollar, and does this kind of accelerate its downfall? And if anything, my argument would be probably not, because it's kind of almost not 14 months later, what we've seen is that actually the US dollar is still paramount. Russia is finding it extremely difficult to do anything because no bank in the world will touch Russian rubles on fear of what the US will do to them. So, yeah, a long way of saying I understand the kind of the political retreat, and I actually have a bit of sympathy with that if I think about being an everyday American. But to be fair, that I don't see that as changing much of their behaviour around the world, and definitely not their economic clout either.
And I guess it's perception, right? Like I spent the weekend. I'm trying to think of some of the names. So I was learning a little bit more about the dollar milkshake theory by a fellow named Brent Johnson. I was listening to a podcast with Peter Schiff. That's always going to get you angry. So I guess depending on what you're listening to and surrounding yourself with, it starts to kind of almost build a worldview, which you're almost certain in, but it's not necessarily what will happen. But like I think of my personal experiences growing up next door to the US, having American television, and really getting a sense for this American confidence in themselves. Like they truly believed in the 80s that they were God's gift to the world. And they rightfully had that position in the world. And, in a sense, because they had that confidence, it kind of made them an effective superpower because they genuinely believed that they were righteous back then. I don't believe that still exists. And I think there's been a slow and steady march away from conservative values. And that has, in some cases, contributed to downfall of some parts of American society, I think. And even just traveling there a few years back before the pandemic hit, seeing the homelessness in the areas that we had previously traveled to before was quite confronting. And I don't know if this is a trend or if that's just another data point that would suggest that this is the downfall of a once great empire, but it certainly feels like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think about that as really being a symptom of what we've seen over the last 50 years, right? Which is this increasing divergence between the rich and the poor. To be honest, the haves have a hell of a lot more, and the have-nots have a hell of a lot less.
Yeah.
And we see it in New Zealand. We see it every single country in the world. But I kind of, but I think stuff like that is extremely sad, and it's not a great place to be. But yeah, it's kind of where we've kind of seemed to have landed as a society over the better part of the last, probably particularly in the last 20, 30 years. Nicely, actually, that time period coincides with that period of falling interest rates.
Interesting, isn't
it? Where we've kind of moved to a world where the rich keep on getting significantly richer and the poor get left behind.
What do you think about, and sorry to interrupt, but you were saying before, you mentioned the phrase, the weaponization of the US dollar, just in the context of falling interest rates, say from, I guess you could almost say from 40 years ago, really, like steady dropping interest rates over time. Lately, with the rising interest rates, like this is ultra fringe conspiracy theory, this one here. But because hey, it's Tuesday night. What do you think? Like the higher interest rates that we've seen, that if you were borrowing from the US and your servicing costs were just being ratcheted up with each interest rate increase there came through, that would be pretty damaging on your economy, wouldn't it?
Oh, very much. That's why, fundamentally, that's why interest rate rises in the US absolutely kill emerging markets, because
Hmm.
they borrow in US dollars, and then they have to repay in US dollars. The US dollar typically strengthens in this time, and they've got higher repayments to make in their local currencies, plus higher interest rates to go through. So
Hmm.
it's a really, really strong one. I mean, I am going to push that back into the fringe.
That's where it
That's been
belongs. Yeah.
done on purpose. But fundamentally, I mean, for me, the weaponization of the dollar is, it's the first time that we've seen the US kind of go, look, you know what? We are the reserve country. We're a reserve economy of the world. We are the economy that every single country, we are the currency that every single bank in the world needs to deal with if they want
Hmm.
to transact offshore. And so, therefore, by putting in such a strict framework of sanctions and basically saying, if we catch anyone dealing with the Russian government or all of these entities associated with the Russian government, we will ban you from clearing US dollars.
Hmm.
That's the first time that we've seen anything happen that to that extent against a large economy, and it's been really interesting what it does.
Hmm.
Does that mean that we are driving probably growth in trade outside of the US dollar trade? Yes, it does. I mean, the Saudis, the Chinese, the Russians, they will all start to use Chinese yuan. But at the end of the day, does that make that a global currency? No. That's just three autocratic regimes that have figured out a way to do business to get around a set of sanctions.
Hmm.
Um, to become a reserve currency, you've got to have certain parameters that sit in place, right? You got to have freedom of movement of currency, and actually, the Chinese don't have that. The Chinese yuan, that's still kind of, you got restrictions coming in and out. You've got to have a political system whereby you are very confident in property rights. You're confident that a debt, and I take out a debt and a Chinese denominated piece of debt, I know kind of the rights that I'm going to have for that, and I know I'm going to be able to claim on it, and I know where that goes. I don't think you have that in China at the moment. And so all of these kind of the true capitalist things that we see that you really need to see to create a global currency, I don't see that happening.
But you think that like that would be the assumption that I would use as well, right? Like those principles are almost like preconditions required for you to have a world reserve currency. But there is one wild card that I think we need to be thinking of, and that's technology, right?
uh,
Like as technology is improving, and we have China with their CBDC, that
yep.
will effectively mean it's programmable money. So if you can trust maths, now you can possibly trust their CBDC. So, like some of those principles that we would say had to be in place last time, maybe in the new world where it's more technology led rather than government led, maybe there's other ways that we could look at this. Maybe there is a chance that there could be an actual proper, legit choice in terms of another currency.
And look, so you know more about these than me. And my question to you is, under a Chinese yuan CBDC, how much control will the Chinese government have? Because fundamentally, right, that's what it's all going to come down to. It's a currency issued by the Reserve Bank of China. They're still controlling interest rates. Are you able to construct a set of assets and liabilities and loans, a banking system that sits on top of that? I'm
Mm.
not 100% sure you can.
No, neither am I. Neither I don't. There's so much about that that I don't know. But as it relates to control, I'm sure they can control their citizens. I'm sure they do. But if they want to play the game, they've shown us in the past before that they can be good at business and they can play nice for a season. What's
Oh,
that?
and that's the issue, right? I mean, you look at what's happening on TikTok, and I think that's a perfect example of one where you go, there is just no way that you're going to get Western countries using it. I mean, they can't even bring themselves to use a social media app, let alone that world there. And I think what that does bring, though, what I find fascinating, and this is, I guess, thinking further about this. I mean, if you've got a US Fed issued stablecoin, then I think that gets fascinating, right?
Mhm.
Because fundamentally, at that point, what you've done is you've done away with the banking system,
Mm.
completely disintermediated the banking system by putting them into a world where it's kind of just happening around them, right? You kind of just put it all on blockchain and everything happens there.
Yeah.
The
And
issue,
yeah. Go
the
ahead. Sorry.
issue with that, which is why there's probably a hell of a lot of nervousness around it, is then they've lost control. Because of it's done through an anonymous blockchain where people are just transacting US dollars, and anyone can kind of turn up to the Fed and go, hey, here are my $60 billion worth of US dollar stable coins. Can you please give me $60 billion in my real bank account? That I think that's a piece that goes, that's logically where this is going to land. As my view. But
Yeah, like I'm looking forward to that, because that means maybe my gold and my Bitcoin will be worth something if they back it with that. But
I mean, we're working with some offshore people at the moment, right?
Mhm.
And we've found that it is significantly faster, cheaper, easier to pay them in USDC, because fundamentally, right, if I do it through a banking system, it's going to cost me 3-4% every time I make the transactions happen. Whereas I do it here, it costs me about 0.75% of the transaction costs. And literally, I'm paying out of my New Zealand bank account at 3 o'clock today, and I got confirmation at 3:05 from the person offshore that they had the money.
Which is
And
quite crazy, right? So what you're basically saying, just for our just for our listeners who might not know what a stable coin is and effectively and how it works, is it's kind of like US dollars, but USDC is a stable coin, which means that its value is linked to the US dollar. So what you're effectively doing, Rupert, correct me if I'm wrong, is you're paying people overseas
yeah,
using infrastructure, which is blockchain powered infrastructure, bypassing the banking system, but they're still getting US dollars on the other end. Sorry, go ahead.
and that's why it's so powerful, because, and that's where I see this going, right? And to be fair, that's also where I see kind of my that's where I see cryptocurrency going, and that's where I see a lot of these blockchains going. So 50 million smart contracts have now been executed over the Ethereum network, for example, generating $2 billion in revenue, which I found out the other day, which I found fascinating.
Yeah.
But that's kind of, and that's to me where this goes, is actually the Ethereum coin or the Solana or whatever the coin is that's being used is actually kind of, all that is the processing power to enable these transactions. That actually, it's these stable coins, it's the lending contracts, the term deposits, all of these products, which are now going to be built on top of these networks using US dollars. And I think personally, it'll only be a little while. It's either going to be the regulator that effectively turns USDC and Tether into proper, basically very safe products, or the regulator's going to have to create one themselves. But it is a fascinating kind of outcome when you think about where that world is going. And then what does that do, right? To me, that means you've still got the strength of the US dollar, because that's the currency that everyone wants to transact in. But has the US Fed lost control of the US dollar?
Please pardon the intrusion for a short ad break. Some financial decisions are easier to make than others. Taking a closer look at your KiwiSaver is seldom a waste of time, though, especially when you're getting some qualified advice with it. As a financial advisor myself, Quora is one of the providers that we work with, and I love Quora KiwiSaver for some of my clients because of the access to low-cost passive funds, with the possibility of outperformance using their specialty bolt-on funds. If you'd like some advice with KiwiSaver, check out the show notes and get in touch. Until then, remember,
this is not financial advice, okay? And you gotta believe me, nobody knows more about investing than I do.
Now let's get back to the show. Well, I think like with the Fed coin, with the US Fed CBDC, like that's already kind of, they're implementing the first stage of that already. So it's happening. It's kind of like almost a nuclear arms race, but in the financial system. Who can get there first and who can expand their network using their CBDC first. I think that's kind of the play here. And that's possibly explaining some of the story, I think, behind why we're seeing regulation turned up so much right now in the crypto space, because it's all about getting the environment right before the Fed coin goes live. And then you could, if you wanted to, bolt on another conspiracy theory there to say that the rising interest rates to create a little bit of drama is necessary so that we all cry out for a CBDC, which is like that, regardless of how it comes to pass and how we actually end up adopting it with open arms, is almost irrelevant. The fact is that that's where we're going. It will create a lot of disruption, but a phenomenal amount of opportunity. And I think from a New Zealand perspective, where if we continue to play this fine line between trying to play both sides almost with the China and the US story, because that's what we've almost been doing for the last few years. If we continue to do that, then we might have an opportunity to make a good decision knowing we have choice, whereas I think other countries might be more locked into the US system, which may be the best thing. And I don't want to pick sides there,
No,
but
doesn't it all come back to? I mean, look, I'm a little bit skeptical on a lot of this stuff, right? Doesn't it come down to expediency? I mean, let's be honest. Let's think about the Chinese-Australian relationship over the better part of the last kind of 5 to 10 years. They've hated each other, and they've been very rude about each other. They're kind of doing everything they can to kind of kill that relationship. Yet they're still kind of top 2 trading partners for each other, because they know that the Chinese know that they can't survive without the Australian coal, Australian iron ore, and the Chinese also know that the Australians have got no other market, so they need to keep on selling it in.
Yeah.
So they've done things like wine, crayfish, all of the stuff that, let's be honest, is nothing and doesn't mean anything. And so I guess that's what I mean about these relationships of expediency.
Right.
Fundamentally, people will always keep on trading. They will keep on doing stuff while they can, if there's money to be made and if they need it. And I think at times, and New Zealand is no different, right? I think at times we might have probably gone too far down this route of, look, we have to win China, and we will kind of turn a blind eye to absolutely everything and not care about anything. But there is nothing. I don't think we kind of spend far too long talking about needing to trade, needing to choose. At the end of the day, China still needs our milk. We're the largest exporter of milk in the world. They're not going to get it from anywhere else. They still need meat. Whilst arguably our meat products, our forestry products, they could find from other parts of the world. But I think we kid ourselves when we kind of talk about we need to choose. We just need to figure out a way to work with both, and we need to find a way to balance out humanitarian versus the economic.
Yeah. I guess, like, ultimately at the end of the day, coming from New Zealand again, let's not put too much faith in milk, because remember, you can milk anything with nipples. So I don't know. China's pretty clever, right? Maybe they got cats. Who knows? Anyway.
But it's only a matter of time, right? Before the alternatives come up. But hey, we won't figure that out. Now we're back to a very different conversation, which is actually how do we move up the value chain in New Zealand?
That's right.
And that's how do we get? China loves us, to be blunt, because we're a great supplier of raw commodities. We don't want to process anything. We don't want to add value to anything. We're very happy to send bulk raw commodities up to China, whether it be logs, whether it be whole carcasses of meat now, and we're not even butchering it here ourselves, or whether it be bulk milk powder and letting them add the value up there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I kind of feel like we are living in a time of change, and we need to kind of prepare for some degree of transformation up ahead. And going back to what we started with if there was, and let's just say that there's probably somewhere between a less than 20% chance that this is even a possibility right now, right? Where the US dollar does properly lose its reserve status. That does have implications to investments though, right? Like if all our investments are denominated in US dollars, then like from your perspective, Rupert, thinking as a fund manager now, how would that affect things apart from maybe emerging markets looking like an attractive play, perhaps in a new world like this? Does that create a lot of problems?
Creates huge problems because fundamentally, right? What do we do? So I think about the different markets. So let's start at the stock market. 60% of the global stock market is the US market. And let's be honest, if the US has been supplanted as the appropriate currency as the place to be, that's going to have a massive implication for the US market. Yeah. And so we're going to see a revaluation of companies. We're going to need to kind of move investments to other things, into other parts of the world. In terms of regulation, that's probably what scares me the most, right? So we've got the US SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission. We've got the Futures and Derivatives Commission, FTTC. All of these entities are what set the global standards. And they set the global standards because fundamentally they have the reserve currency, they have the biggest sets of markets, they have the deepest markets, they have the deepest liquidity pools. And that's why everyone goes, cool, we want to trade, so therefore we need to trade in that market, so we have to do that. So by giving up on the US dollar as the global powerhouse, what that means is the liquidity pools are no longer going to be there. Investors are going to move to other markets. And that's going to have profound implications on the rules. That's going to have profound implications on how things are regulated. And it's going to basically create a new order in which how we need to do things and where we do things. And so I think it will be fascinating to see where that goes and how that happens. That's a little bit of why I'm quite skeptical, because I don't actually think many large investors want to see that happen. And also, you also got to remember, right, the power which, and this is why I think it was probably the biggest reason why I don't think we're going to get there, because they have the ability to set all those rules, whether it be as simple as a bank, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the fact that if you need to raise capital, significant amounts of capital, you have to go and talk to US investors, because fundamentally all of the global investors are putting their money with US fund managers. There's just no way the US ever gives up that power unless we go back to kind of gives up their security power.
Yeah.
That's what we're back to, right?
Correct. Yeah. Well, yeah, and it's a fascinating, like, this is a fascinating conversation, I think, because it's connected to just so many things. And but also, again, just to like reiterate that this isn't necessarily bad. Like, this could be good. Like, I think, again, going back to the regulation, we often but when AML, anti-money laundering legislation, and KYC, know your customer, and there's a whole other raft of new stuff that we had to sort of abide by when the US was paranoid with terrorists. And now there's a new bogeyman. There's probably going to be other new stuff coming down the pike, but that kind of has to be efficient, and that has to be fit for purpose for the new world. And because if there is another option for us to choose from, that puts pressure on the designers of those no one's going to deal with something which is too difficult and cumbersome. People are going to go for whatever is easiest. So,
well, no, but the fear in my world is everyone goes straight to what is the easiest. So that's like case in point is FTX in Bahamas, right? They went to the Bahamas because that was easy. You had Binance kind of playing regulatory arbitrage over the world at the moment, which they've just been pulled up for in the US. And as an investor, that really scares me, because one of the big things that I really like as an investor is I can play on the US stock market. I can buy derivatives out of Chicago issued by a US bank. I'm very comfortable settling in US dollars. Europe, I'm pretty comfortable with as well, because they basically copied that framework. You know what? I don't understand the rules in some of the other parts of the world, and I'm not 100% confident of what's going to happen. And so the big fear that I have as an institutional investor is that as markets move and the rules don't follow, we end up creating a Wild West, and that's when people lose.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. I want to keep on going, but we got kids to put to bed. Oh man, that's a good conversation though. Go ahead, Sam.
And we didn't get too conspiratorial.
I tried. Well, that's my maximum setting. So maybe I'm not a conspiracy theorist after all. Well, I'll figure something out. And my apologies. We had a couple of comments. We'll if you have any comments, then definitely feel free to ask them. Next time we'll speak to those ones. And if you have anything during the week, there is a link in the show notes where you can ask us anything, and just put something out there, and we'll try to speak to that one next week. What are we going to talk about next week? Well, there's plenty to choose from. So what do you think? Yeah, maybe a little bit of the technology piece. Maybe touch on crypto a little bit, perhaps. See what's happening there.
I think that's quite an interesting piece at the moment. I think there's a good conversation to be had around, and I actually think it follows on nicely from this one around, you know what, crypto's been through a lot in the last kind of 9 to 12 months. But actually, has this been the quickest force growing up that's ever happened, right? Crypto finally coming of age.
That's right. 70% up this year with the old Bitcoin. So, crypto's not dead. It's not necessarily winter. There's a little bit of a thaw here. So it's cool. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Rupert. And thanks everyone for listening.
And thanks everyone.